1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
This poem by John Marzolo is popularly taught to children in America who recite it on Columbus Day to idolize and celebrate Columbus.
But consider this, in 1493, Columbus stole all he could see.
Would this be more accurate considering Columbus's mistreatment of the native people and the pillaging by the conquistadors?
So what is the legacy of Columbus? The discovery of America or the conquest of America? We hope to answer that in this video. The story of how Christopher Columbus sailed from Spain to find a new westward route to India and instead stumbled upon the continent of America is well known. It is a history that is taught in schools, where the date of 12th October 1492 comes to assume an almost legendary significance, for it was on this day that the old world collided with the new world.
A simple search leads one to innumerable documentaries on Columbus and his discovery of America, which points to the kind of hold he has on our imagination even after 500 years. Many of these videos hail Columbus as an extraordinary explorer who changed the course of history with his ingenuity and superior navigational skills.
Italians have long celebrated Christopher Columbus in tribute to their shared heritage. In 1937, President Roosevelt proclaimed October 12th as Columbus Day. And in 1971, President Nixon declared Columbus Day a national holiday to be observed on the second Monday of October.
The children know that Christopher Columbus was born in Italy. He was a great explorer, a great navigator, a great cartographer. And
so to link this statue with the issue of slavery down south. Now, what's the difference between the both of them? Regardless what the historians say, they don't agree. And Christopher Columbus isn't part of it.
Born in Genoa, Italy, of humble parents, Christopher Columbus grew up to become an experienced seafarer. He sailed the Atlantic as far as Iceland and West Africa. His adventures convinced him that the world must be round. Therefore, the fabled riches of the East, spices, silk, and gold, could be had by sailing west, superseding the overland route through the Middle East, which the Turks had closed off to commerce. To get funding for his enterprise, Columbus appealed before monarch after monarch in Western Europe. After initially being dismissed by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Columbus finally got his chance when Queen Isabella decided to underwrite a modest expedition.
500 years ago, there were people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, but neither knew about the other. On the western side, our side, the people had reddish-brown skins and lived in huts or wigwams. On the eastern side, in Europe, the people were white-skinned. They had learned how to build houses and large sailing ships, but they still didn't know much about the rest of the world. In fact, most of them believed the earth was flat. Then one day, a map maker named Christopher Columbus had an idea.
Do you know what? I think the world isn't flat at all. I think it's round like a ball.
Columbus, along with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, set forth from Spain. The journey was difficult. The ship sailed west into the unknown Atlantic for more than 2 months. The crew almost mutinied and threatened to throw Columbus overboard. Finally, they reached the West Indies on October 12, 1492. Although Columbus made 3 more voyages to America, he never really knew he had discovered a new world. He died in obscurity, unappreciated, and penniless. Yet, without his daring, American history would have been very different. For in a sense, Columbus made it all possible.
Columbus's voyage was an inspiration to struggling people all across Europe, symbolizing freedom and new beginnings. And his discovery gave our grandparents and great-grandparents the chance to come here and build better lives for their children. Don't we deserve a hero to remind everyone that our country was built on the struggles of immigrants? Because it's tradition, Ordinary people need their heroes and their founding myths. Can't we just keep celebrating the way we've been doing for a century without having to delve into all this serious research? It's not like anyone is actually celebrating genocide.
Is this image of Columbus historically accurate? Was he really this brilliant seafarer and an indispensable figure without whom the American continents would have been lost forever? What about the Native Americans? Where do they fit in this narrative? Why is there no mention of their trials against the Spanish conquistadors?
A closer study of historical sources would show that popular histories often gloss over crucial details, diverging from facts into the realm of fiction, denying the centuries of cruelty and atrocities that the voyages of Columbus unleashed upon the native populations of America.
Now, we will delve into the first two voyages of Columbus and compare his motivations, destinations, interaction with the natives, and what the conquistadors left behind. Columbus's voyages to the New World have been extensively documented through letters, dispatches, and historical accounts written by him and his contemporaries. These records were further elaborated upon by writers like Fernández de Oviedo, Bartolomé de las Casas, and Columbus's own son, Hernando. A substantial collection of documents related to Columbus's expeditions was preserved in the Casa de las Indias at Seville and later transferred to Hispaniola.
Christopher Columbus's first voyage, sponsored by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, commenced on August 3, 1492. He set sail from Palos de la Frontera in Spain with the primary objective to find a westward route to Asia, particularly to reach the rich spice markets of the East Indies. Columbus believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, he could reach Asia more quickly than the traditional eastward route around Africa. After a journey lasting about 2 months, Columbus and his crew made landfall in the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. They initially believed they had reached islands off the coast of Asia, but they had actually arrived in the Caribbean. Encountering the indigenous Taino people, they subsequently went to several islands in the Caribbean, including present-day Cuba and Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He encountered various indigenous people whom he called Indians. Due to his mistaken belief that he had reached the Indian Ocean, Columbus returned to Spain in March 1493, bringing back native artifacts, reports of newfound lands, and captives to demonstrate the success of his voyage. His return sparked great excitement across Europe and marked the beginning of sustained European voyages and colonization of the Americas.
Columbus's second voyage commenced on September 24, 1493, just over a year after his return from his first voyage. This expedition was much larger and more ambitious than the first, consisting of a fleet of 17 ships and 1,500 men. The primary goal of Columbus's second voyage was to establish permanent settlements in the Caribbean and further penetrate the islands that he had encountered during his first voyage. He established the first Spanish colony in the Americas, naming it La Isabela on the northern coast of Hispaniola. Columbus's second voyage intensified the interaction between Europeans and indigenous people, setting the stage for centuries of conflict and exploitation in the Americas.
The Native Americans treated Columbus with kindness and hospitality, a signifier of their civilization achievements. The king of the island, accompanied by over 200 men, visited Columbus's ships in a grand ceremony. Through gestures and limited communication, they exchanged gifts, and the king expressed admiration for Columbus's possessions. This kindness of the Native Americans turned into suspicion and hostility due to the actions of Columbus and his crew. Columbus and his crew imposed harsh demands on the indigenous population, including forced labor, tribute payments, and the seizure of food and valuables. They also engaged in acts of violence, including the enslavement and mistreatment of indigenous people, as well as sexual exploitation and brutality.
On the Second Voyage, an account by Michele de Cuneo, a nobleman of Savona, shows us how the Spaniards treated indigenous women. Quote unquote, "While I was on the boat, I captured a very beautiful Carib woman, whom the aforesaid Lord Admiral gave to me, and with whom, having brought her into my cabin, and she being naked as is their custom, I conceived the desire to take my pleasure. I wanted to put my desire to execution, but she was unwilling for me to do so, and treated me with her nails in such wise that I would have preferred never to have begun. But seeing this, in order to tell you the whole, even to the end, I took a rope end and thrashed her well, following which she produced such screaming and wailing as would cause you not to believe your ears. Finally, we reached an agreement such that, I can tell you, she seemed to have been raised in a veritable school of harlots." Indian women are women, or Indians to the second power, hence they become the object of a double rape.
Let's reevaluate some popular myths about Columbus's discovery of America. Columbus Day, celebrated in the United States, is often associated with honoring Italian American heritage. However, it's important to recognize that Christopher Columbus himself had no direct connections to the land that would have become the United States, as he actually never stepped on the mainland North America over his 4 voyages. While Columbus was indeed born in the Republic of Genoa, part of Italy, he did not receive support from the Italian government or monarchs for his voyages. Instead, he sought funding from the Spanish crown. Also, after the atrocities committed by Christopher Columbus and his administration in the New World were brought to light, the Spanish crown revoked Columbus's gubernatorial title, stripping him of his authority over the territories he had governed. Contrary to popular belief, Christopher Columbus was not the first person to propose or prove that the earth was round. The concept of spherical earth dates back to the ancient times among the Greek philosophers to medieval Islamic scholars like Al-Idrisi and Al-Biruni. During the Middle Ages, maps and globes from this period often depicted the earth as a sphere. By the time Columbus embarked on his voyages in the late 15th century, the idea of a spherical earth was not new or revolutionary.
Columbus's motivations for his voyage are multifaceted, as revealed through various historical accounts. While he initially framed his expedition as a missionary endeavor to spread Christianity, his underlying pursuit of wealth and power becomes increasingly apparent. Bartolomé de las Casas emerges as a crucial figure in providing a counter-narrative to the glorified accounts of Columbus's exploits. As a staunch advocate for indigenous rights, Las Casas offers a nuanced perspective that acknowledges Columbus's achievements while also condemning his exploitation and mistreatment of native populations.
There are apparent contradictions in Columbus's narrative about the Native Americans. He notes their naivety in handling assault by its blade and writes that weapons they have none, nor are they acquainted with them. Yet, in the same paragraph, he notes that some of them bear scars from wounds received in battles with neighboring people. Still, he believes that he could conquer the whole of them with 50 men and govern them as he pleased. Later, with no further comment, he describes some of the natives of a particular island as being at war with each other. He also writes that they have no religion and thus would make easy converts to Christianity. Yet, when some of the natives gather on the shores and excitedly call out to the ships, Columbus perceives them as giving, quote, thanks to God. This illustrates that Columbus is able to see the natives only in terms with which he is familiar. Columbus had no qualms about taking some of them hostage back to Spain in order to learn his language. They are primitive enough that they might be held as unwilling captives, yet they are perceived as intelligent beings who would be able to learn Spanish.
Native Americans were initially drawn based on ancient expectations and on sketchy information relayed by Columbus. The single-leaf illustration, published in Augsburg in 1505, shows the natives as cannibalistic primitives. The accompanying text relates that they have no government or private property.
As we can see, the narrative surrounding Christopher Columbus is often filled with biased and skewed perspectives. Children's books and historical accounts frequently portray indigenous people in a stereotypically racist and dehumanizing light. Many children's books about Columbus show the natives as animalistic on the beach or in the jungle, but never show the humanizing part of their lives, like where they live, slept, or ate. This can lead to a leap of logic that the natives didn't have homes, allowing for the racist narrative of indigenous people as being beast-like, living off the earth in trees or caves, to be easier to be accepted. The myth of the civilized versus the savage in the context of Columbus and Native Americans encapsulates the Eurocentric narrative that portrayed indigenous people as primitive and uncivilized compared to Europeans. Expanding on this myth involves delving into the cultural biases and ethnocentric perspectives held by Columbus and his contemporaries. They viewed indigenous societies through the lens of their own Eurocentric worldview, labeling them as inferior or barbaric because their customs, languages, and religious practices differed from those of the Europeans. The biased perspective justified European colonization efforts as they saw themselves as bringing progress, Christianity, and civilization to savage lands.
However, the reality is far more complex. Indigenous societies in Americas had rich and diverse cultures, sophisticated social structures, advanced agricultural practices, and complex belief systems. They had developed intricate systems of governance, trade networks, and sustainable ways of life that were often dismissed or misunderstood by Europeans. Moreover, indigenous people had a deep connection to their land and environment, often living in harmony with nature, a concept foreign to European colonizers. The myth of civilized versus savage served as a justification for the violent displacement, forced assimilation, and exploitation of indigenous people by European colonizers. It perpetuated stereotypes and undermined the autonomy and dignity of indigenous cultures and societies. Furthermore, it facilitated the erasure of indigenous history, knowledge, and contributions to human civilization. David Stannard uses the phrase American Holocaust to describe the devastation brought upon the indigenous people of Americas following the arrival of Europeans. He contends that this led to one of the most massive genocides in human history, often overshadowed or downplayed in historical narratives. He argues that the destruction of indigenous populations was not only due to diseases, but also deliberate acts of violence, enslavement, and cultural eradication by the European colonizers.
There is, for example, the case of a small Indian boy whose name no one knows today and whose unmarked skeletal remains are hopelessly intermingled with those of hundreds of anonymous others in a mass grave on the American plains, but a boy who once played on the banks of a quiet creek in eastern Colorado until the morning. In 1864, when the American soldiers came, then, as one of the cavalrymen later told it, while his compatriots were slaughtering and mutilating the bodies of all the women and all the children they could catch, he spotted the boy trying to flee. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was left behind, following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, travelling on the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a bitch. I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child, but he missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. We need to make an effort to understand in human terms what happened, what was destroyed, what was brutally taken away. The devastation in the Americas after Columbus arrived was so severe that very few individual stories survived for us to remember.
Why did they think it was right or just to do what they did was, to take our lands and to push us off our lands and try to eliminate us as a people?
If there are people there and they are not Christians, they do not have a right of title to land. They have only the right of occupancy. From our perspective, the same right as a rabbit running on the ground, or a turkey, or a deer, or a buffalo, or an Indian.
We can see changing literature with efforts from Native Americans to unmask the cruelty of Spanish expeditions started by Columbus and his supposed discovery of America, which was a part of colonial imagination of emptiness of land which was already occupied by the indigenous people.
In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Columbus knew the world was round, so he looked for the east while westward bound. But he didn't find what he thought he found, and somebody was already here. The Inuit and Cherokee, the Aztec and Menominee, the Onondaga and the Cree. Columbus sailed across the sea, but somebody was already here. It isn't like it was empty space. Caribs met him face to face. Could anyone discover the place when somebody was already here? So tell me, who discovered what? He thought he was in a different spot. Columbus was lost. The Caribs were not. They were already here.
History is always a complex dialogue between people about different ways to interpret the past. The contestations around Columbus's legacy is a great example of this. Despite efforts by Native Americans to raise awareness of the atrocities committed by Columbus, there are still staunch Eurocentric traditionalists who defend him. This defense often stems from a deeply ingrained historical narrative that glorifies European explorers and justifies colonization as a necessary step in the progress of Western civilization. Some conservatives argue that Columbus's voyages were pivotal in connecting the Old World with the New World and paved the way for the spread of Christianity and European culture. They downplay or deny the extent of violence, exploitation, and cultural destruction inflicted upon the indigenous people by Columbus and subsequent European colonizers. Additionally, there is a tendency to view criticisms of Columbus as attacks on Western heritage and tradition. This ideological stance can lead to resistance against re-evaluating Columbus's legacy and acknowledging the full scope of the harm caused to indigenous communities.
Columbus was not blameless. He sold natives into slavery. But the explorer did not invent slavery, which was common around the world long before and long after Columbus's time. As for the charge of genocide, there was no genocide. There were atrocities, most occurring after Columbus was dead and gone. It's unfair to focus only on Columbus's sins. It's also unfair to judge someone who lived 500 years ago by today's standards. When we celebrate Columbus, we celebrate the arrival of Western civilization to the Western Hemisphere. And if you can't celebrate that, it says much more about your moral compass than about history's greatest explorer.
Christopher Columbus was a very great man and one of the most consequential figures to ever live on planet Earth. But the whole stolen land thing is preposterous. There were maybe as low as 1 or 2 million Indians living on the entire North American continent by the 15th century. And the idea that a ragtag collection of warring Stone Age tribes somehow laid eternal claim to this entire hemisphere is just insane.
When it comes to the history of America, listening to Native Americans and indigenous voices about the destructive legacy and genocide of Columbus is crucial. These communities have first-hand knowledge and experience of the devastating impact of European colonization, including the violence, displacement, and cultural erasure perpetrated by Columbus and those who followed him. By centering Native American and indigenous voices, we can gain a more accurate understanding of history that goes beyond the traditional Eurocentric narratives that have glorified explorers like Columbus. This shift allows us to confront uncomfortable truths about the darker aspects of colonization and challenge the myth of Columbus as a heroic figure. Re-evaluating Columbus's legacy through the lens of indigenous voices is not only an act of historical justice, but also a necessary step towards reconciliation and healing.
The year 1492 marks the transition from independence to colonization for Native Americans. As David Stannard argues, from almost the instant of first human contact between Europe and the Americas, firestorms of plagues, diseases, and purposeful genocide began laying waste the American natives. Although at times operating independently, for most of the long centuries of devastation that followed 1492, disease and genocide were interdependent forces, acting dynamically whipsawing their victims between plague and violence, each one feeding upon the other, and together driving countless numbers of entire ancient societies to the brink, and often over the brink, of total extermination. The legacy of Columbus is more accurately looked through the lens of colonialism, imperialism, and bloody atrocity that left a legacy of genocide and slavery that endures in some degree even